Alpha. Nobody stole the clicker. That's good. I would have butchered their names too. And by the way, for the first time I met Michael in person right there, 50 feet away. So he saw me on Zoom, not Zoom. We don't do Zoom, WebEx, Teams for a while, but he hasn't been here until today, if I'm not mistaken. Right. So whatever he said about my presentation earlier, don't ask me about ladders, okay? But we are here today to talk about resource mix and planning, and I'm honored to be up here with these two. These two are professionals in part of the organizations that you have that is critically important, something I've put a lot of emphasis on in my life and my experience over the years. When I was in the industry, I relied on my planning department exclusively. I was in operations, but they were the ones that developed the facility ratings. They were the ones that developed the RAPs, everything else associated with some of that future look. They were the ones that had to deal with Texas when we split generation and transmission. When Senate Bill 7 came out and said, there will be a market in Texas and generation and transmission had to be split, and they opened the market, which meant the native load that I had in my footprint as a TOP grew. Well, my native generation was about 2,200. I got 2,400 megawatts of IPP in less than 24 months. So it was a pretty significant impact, doubled my capacity within my footprint simply because of where I was in Texas. So the art of planning is something we don't think about very often, but it is critically important to operations. You operate to the plan or you plan to operate. It's always one of those opportunities. These folks have to deal with a lot of variables a long time ahead, a long way ahead of when something actually happens. So we want to talk about that because of what is happening out there. And we want to give them an opportunity to talk about what they do a little bit. So please go ahead and introduce what you do, how you do it. You're welcome to stand up here if you like, and I'll sit down. But please take a moment to do that.
Thank you, Curtis. All right, good afternoon, everyone. When I was in college, I always used to enroll in early morning classes because I did really bad test-wise if it was after lunch. So, all right, I'm Aditya Jain Prabhakar. I currently serve as the Director of Resource Assessment and Planning at California ISO. Resource adequacy is one of the main functions of my team. What it does is it's a planning and procurement process to ensure sufficient capacity is made available to the ISO in the right places and at the right times. It's a coordinated activity between the load serving entities, the local regulatory authorities, the California Public Utilities Commission, California Energy Commission, the governor's office, and the list keeps going on. There are too many players, each with a unique role and each with their own fresh perspective at the problem at hand, and all coming together at the ISO. A little brief for those that are looking at California ISO footprint for the first time. It's a federally regulated nonprofit organization. The ISO manages the high voltage electric grid for California and portion of Nevada. The map is in the background here on the left-hand side. We've seen about 52,000 megawatts of peak load in 2022. We serve about 32 million people. That's pretty huge. Going back to the landscape of how the planning activities happen in the California ISO BAA, the Balancing Authority area, the California Energy Commission, called CEC on this slide, sets the load forecast for all the load serving entities. They collect all the information, do a bottom-up and top-down load forecast, and set that. That becomes your forecast that you plan for. Against that backdrop, the California Public Utility Commission and other local regulatory authorities develop what is called as the preferred system portfolio that becomes your resource plan for the future. And then that resource plan then gets cited and given to the ISO in its transmission planning process to conduct and develop transmission planning framework. So the planning for the grid of the future is a shared responsibility that is often trying to bring together from multiple entities. Yeah, the other thing I want to mention is we are constantly updating our long-term and short-term planning based on new information as it becomes available. So, all right, I'll pass it back to Curtis to keep it brief.
Thank you, Aditya. Alrighty, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mike Eugenus. I'm the Director of Resource Planning at Arizona Public Service, APS. We're the largest load-serving entity in Arizona. We are a vertically integrated utility, and so we have both generation, transmission, and distribution resources, and plan for all of those things on our system. A couple of facts for our service territory. We're cover 11 out of 15 counties in Arizona. We're a little bit over 6,000 employees. The other significant power entity in Arizona is SRP, and I know there's several SRP folks that are in attendance today, and we kind of share responsibility for the vast majority of the electric power generation, transmission, and distribution throughout the state. Our resource planning process is a little bit different than and how Aditya has described it for the CAISO, since we, being a vertically integrated utility, have all of these responsibilities kind of in one place as a company. And so it is my team's responsibility to understand what the load forecast is going to be in the future, study the resource adequacy parameters of different resource types into the future, as well as the amount of PRM or planning reserve margin, or really just extra resources that we need to maintain reliability, and then ultimately inform on the portfolio of resources that are necessary to maintain reliability at least cost for our customers. And so as we go through our all-source RFP procurement process at APS, we look at all of the bids that come in. As a part of that process, we evaluate those bids and then ultimately select the projects that are kind of least costs for our customers while maintaining that reliability standard. And so we have all of those functions incorporated inside our business. And so a little bit different from how CAISO has it, where you have the CPUC who does the orders around procurement, and then you have individual entities that participate within CAISO that are actually performing that procurement, and you have several different folks that are studying the resource adequacy aspects of resources in California. All of that is kind of unified for us at APS. Aditya, mentioned the number of folks that are involved in the process. And while I may represent a single utility and a vertically integrated one, I can also confirm there is a lot of folks that get involved in resource planning, even in a kind of more simplified environment that I find myself operating in, with the governor's office liking to participate. And we are governed by the Arizona Corporation Commission, which issues kind of rulings and determines prudency for our resources into the future, as well as almost innumerable number of stakeholders that have opinions and thoughts about the resource future for Arizona. So I'm very excited to participate in this conversation with you today.
Make sure I don't fall. Thank you both for that introduction there. And that kind of set the stage, what you're looking at. These two individuals, similar roles, different perspectives, different sizes, different thoughts associated with it, and different inputs, perhaps. Very much so. And so hopefully they weren't here for the TPL. You were here for the TPL 8. We'll have a conversation about that later, see how that impacts you. But I think it's important to think about what the future is, because that's what planning is about. Now, I had some other pictures up here that I hoped would have passed muster, but I guess they were didn't make it. So sometimes it's good that we have technical writers that tell me I can't put in certain pictures. But this is what I think about as a grade school kid, what we thought about the future. You wrote certain answers on there, you picked a number, you did this little game, and probably today's kids don't even know what this game is. Probably they don't even create it. Some of you are laughing because you probably do, and others are looking at me like, what the heck is that? I can't build one anymore? But this is kind of the thought process. It's not the same planning that we had 10 years ago. It's not the same planning we had 5 years ago to a large degree. It's something different that we have to think about, that we really need to think, how are we approaching this? What are the inputs? What are the changes? The resource mix here has changed so drastically, it's hard to keep up with. There's that forecasted storm in the future here. What does that look like? And how do you accurately calculate where that's going to be and what impacts there are going to be on your system? What does it look like? And from a resource perspective, you really got to think there is a storm of resource inputs out there. There's a lot of different things pulling on resources and pushing on resources. And these folks and you have to react to that. And so we wanted to discuss that a little bit. And the first thing you look at is a capacity thought. I mean, when you think about how many numbers of battery, solar, and wind resources, that normal thought process of base load generation augmented by peaking power to meet demand doesn't work. Doesn't work anymore. You've heard that over and over throughout some of these presentations. But if you look at what data was available back in 2016, 2020, and 2024. This is some long-term reliability assessment information provided by the RAPA group within WEC. If you look at batteries, solar, wind, look at the numbers that were projected and how they changed over time. Now, it doesn't look so bad for batteries on existing plus T1, that first left-hand column, until suddenly you get to 2024 and there's a significant jump in what's there. It wasn't there 4 years before. It wasn't projected 4 years before, and yet it jumped. And oh, by the way, if you look closer today, that number is actually above what was projected last year. So even though the numbers that came into these folks had to determine what looks good, what's going to fit, what do I have to do in terms of transmission, what do I have to do in terms of integrating these resources into their systems, things change significantly. Every one of these, battery, solar, and wind, are above what was projected last year. Now, it makes it a little interesting. We got 27 gig, 55 gig of solar, and 46 gig of wind. And we'll talk about some other things here, but this is just information coming in to WEC and coming into them individually. And so one of the questions that we're thinking about is, okay, what methods or actions have you employed in your planning processes to address these different technologies? And either one of you can go first because the other one will go second, if they want to.
I can go first. So there are a few things that come as the output of resource planning, right? The type, the timing, and the amount are three distinct aspects of the resource plan. It tells you what type of capacity, how much, and when. And as new capacity gets added into the system plan, it is a function of what is currently existing, what more is needed, what is my projected demand, and what is the resource adequacy contribution of these resources. When all of these different variables are part of that equation, getting a solid understanding of the projected resource adequacy contribution of these variable energy resources and energy storage resources as it relates to the rest of the existing system mix becomes important. So we are trying to produce information that is more forward-looking resource adequacy assessments to understand that aspect. There is also better energy modeling that has taken up over the last few years, where you can't really represent and do the load duration curve methodology of assessing system needs that used to work back in the day. Now you have to do an hourly chronological 8760 kind of detailed simulation. So that needs to happen. The long-term plan development, and then there is a portion of that long-term plan that you can actually implement. So which requires a different set of constraints based on what you're able to procure, understanding the political environment, the supply chain constraints, and all of those aspects do come into play in making that determination and decision framework. So that influences your selection of resources somewhat. So it's basically an intersection of the policy, the supply chain environment, the cost of new resources, the appetite that stakeholders have, and all of these other things. But from a modeling standpoint, understanding what these resources are worth in the future and communicating that effectively is one of the key things that we are doing to help with this integrated planning process.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, because I have a sense that we've got a pretty diverse audience in the room today, judging by the presentations that I've listened to so far today, one of which included physical security. And I do resource planning. I have nothing to do with physical security whatsoever. So I imagine there's a number of folks in this room that have nothing to do with resource planning whatsoever. When we talk about, there's two things I wanted to cover here right now. One is Aditya hit the nail on the head. The resource adequacy attributes of different types of resources are incredibly important to understand going forward. But what do I mean by resource adequacy? What I mean by that is, what is the contribution of any incremental amount of resource to serving additional load into the future, maintaining reliability? And so essentially all of the modeling that we do on a resource adequacy basis is trying to understand if I've added a megawatt of load to my system at a certain shape, right? It could be a residential shape, it could be an extra high load factor shape, something that's very stable. What is the resource value of a megawatt of some generation type to serving that incremental load on the system? So if I add 10 megawatts of solar to the system, am I able to serve 10 megawatts of additional residential customers? Am I able to serve 10 megawatts of additional XHLF customers? The answer is no. But we need to understand exactly what that percentage is so that when we do our resource procurement, we're better able to understand the volume of that resource and other resources in the portfolio that ultimately ends up with the same reliability that we've had thus far. The second point that I wanted to make here too is I feel like there's always a lot of conversation. I mean, if we're looking at these charts here, the net effect of these charts is we are buying more batteries, more solar, and more wind in the West than we thought we would. And when I first entered resource planning, one of the questions that I asked and that I still get all the time from stakeholders is, Mr. Eugenis, Director of Resource Planning, what is the cheapest resource out there? And there isn't one cheapest resource at all. It's always a portfolio of resources that you need. You need a combination of not just solar, not just batteries, not just wind, not just natural gas, other baseload resources as well, nuclear, coal generation, whatever they may be, all contribute to that picture of maintaining reliability for your system. And so as we're doing all of this modeling, as we're looking to the future, what we're trying to understand is knowing that I have to get all kinds of resources going forward. I need to maintain diversity, not just for reliability, but also for economics too. What is the best allocation of resources that we should procure to do that? And that's the work that we perform in those resource adequacy studies.
That was very good. Slipped into bow 7 perhaps just a little bit there, but that's fantastic. When you think about, and you mentioned it, the markets, how are they recognizing the benefit of this diversity in technology? Are the proper signals being sent? Is the proper data being provided to help them analyze how they participate with these things? Is that occurring in the real time, in the real world? What does it look like? How do they invest in these diverse technologies?
Thankfully for us, it's the load-serving entities that bring on new resources. But I think the signals that the market provides are often inputs into their decision-making process. In California's Public Utilities Commission Resource Adequacy Framework is a 24-hour slice of day program where basically the portfolio of resources should be able to meet each projected demand of each hour from a dispatch standpoint and a reserve margin, that is additional resources to meet reliability for every hour. So based on that duration, that load shape, their selection of resources sometimes matters. Sometimes it is also a function of what actually is available. When you're looking for a resource adequacy eligible resource that is deliverable in the analysis, basically you have fewer choices available to you. So that dictates the resource selection sometimes. Anything that is APS particularly?
Yeah, I wanted you to go first here, since you guys actually operate a market, and so as a vertically integrated utility too, we participate in the energy imbalance market, which is on a much shorter basis and is kind of incomplete as it relates to a full ISO. But APS is going to in the future be participating in the SPP markets plus day ahead market, so it's still something that's incredibly important to us. I think. I guess I'm going to stick with my rule of twos here in comment responses, but there's one thing that markets do really well, and that's they can get you a really efficient dispatch of resources over a broader service territory. And there's real benefits to that. And the broader the service territory and the more diverse the load and resource types that are available to you, the more benefit that you have as an individual entity participating in a market. So to the question of how do markets incentivize and benefit resource diversity, by having, kind of by design, if I have generation resources, baseload resources, for example, that APS owns and operates, but I may not have enough load for those baseload resources at some times, and maybe I need to modify that generation output, well, that actually comes at an economic cost to me, because baseload resources like to run full out or like to run at really high capacity factors. And so if I run it at a lower capacity factor, it's more expensive on a per megawatt hour basis. In a market, I have the ability to run those baseload resources full out as much as I possibly can. And everybody benefits from the reduced pricing that results in. And if there's a time from a load perspective of really high loads in my region, the desert Southwest, but really mild weather in the Northwest, well, if I'm operating by myself, I'm going to run, natural gas CTs, some kind of peaking unit that's going to have they're generally more inefficient machines. They're going to have really high dollar per megawatt hour costs to run. But if I'm connected to another entity that has other maybe combined cycle plants or those resources that have lower heat rates or more efficient resources, then we can take advantage of that. They make money by selling that generation to me, and my customers benefit because we've avoided the higher cost of a less efficient machine. And so that's a real benefit that you get from markets in terms of dispatch and from diversity of load and generation in a market. The thing that I think we still struggle with, and all markets in the United States struggle with this to differing degrees, is that electricity production is inherently a long-term investment. The things that you have to build to maintain reliability do not get built overnight. They don't get built in 1 year. Some of them get built in 2.5 years, the most aggressive ones. Wind projects, some solar facilities, and some batteries can get built in about 2.5 years. When you start talking about natural gas, timeline's 5 years, could be longer than 5 years. When you talk about nuclear facilities, talking an 8-year plus 10-year, could be more than 10-year timeline to build a facility. And markets do a poor job of providing the signal for long-term investment and, frankly, the necessary protection for that investment, knowing that you're going to get a return on it in the future. And so that's what we're working on, I think, as we look at markets in the West more broadly, is how do we design a market that maintains that benefit in the future of having more folks combined together, better dispatch, more efficiency on the load and generation side, while also giving the proper economic incentives for investment in generation that has a really long time horizon associated with it.
And you did mention the timeframes. Just yesterday during one of the conversations, I think it was Kelly McPherson said they had a battery project in under 10 months from moving dirt to putting it on the grid. So even that is changing, and you have to take that in consideration. And so when you're recognizing the varying technologies output, wind, solar, batteries, and in the case of batteries, change in load profiles. How do you do that? What do you do in terms of looking towards the future? You've got this much wind, this much solar, this much battery. What does it look like? The efficiency of batteries, y'all consider that in load profile? What's that look like?
Let's switch it up this time. Okay. I mean, the answer is yes. And all of these resources, like I was talking about maybe 2 answers ago, depend on each other for their value to the system. A system that has a ton of solar on it relative to its particular demand profile is going to benefit less from an incremental investment in solar because there's already a surplus of it on the system. And conversely, a system that may not have, very much solar generation on it whatsoever may get a really large benefit from having more solar on the system because it frees up, existing resources that we're running during that time, especially if it's a highly kind of dispatchable system. Now you can move that generation to another period and be able to serve more customers during that time. But you're always finding that balance of what is it that the system needs in this time period into the future. Is it more energy deficient? Does it need more solar and wind resources? Does it need more ability to move excess energy from one time period to another? That's where things like battery energy storage and other storage technologies become very valuable. Or is it truly something that you really need a combination of both of those things because you're hedging against events that can be longer in duration? And so as we look at resource adequacy into the future, you have to contemplate that the weather patterns in the West are changing. I mean, we do 40 years of weather data at APS when we study resource adequacy. And in those 40 years of data, when you look at 2023 and you look at 2024, they stand out on the entire graph. So you have to recognize that you're planning for a future that doesn't necessarily look exactly like the past. And your resource mix needs to be resilient to those, edge events that are occurring. I was just reading an article on LinkedIn yesterday that talked about my favorite word that we use in the energy space, which is a Dunkelflaute, which is a German word for essentially dark doldrums, which means when you have cloudy days, you don't have a lot of solar production, and you have no wind on the system. We're going to see more of these into the future. And as you have a grid that is increasingly higher in solar and wind resources, you have to make sure that you have a balance of other resources that's able to ride through these periods where you have less generation available to them. So it's resource adequacy is finding that balance between taking advantage of, resources that may have lower dollar per megawatt hour costs, but require, additional investment to move to whenever the load is present onto the system versus those other resources that, may command a premium if you just look on raw LCOE data, levelized cost of electricity data, may look more expensive, but provide both energy and dispatchable capacity on the system.
Yeah, and from an ISO standpoint, I believe we build in requirements and reserve requirements to carry both the headroom, frequency regulation, the spinning reserves, the non-spinning reserves, all kind of inform what are the resource attributes that are needed in the system to be able to reliably operate the grid. So when you look at the net load curve in California, for example, you see 10,000 megawatts of net load in the middle hours when solar production is pretty high. But as it goes into the evening hours, you suddenly need 20,000 megawatts over 3 hours to ramp up. It comes from a range of energy storage resources, imports, gas-fired generation that quickly can turn on and stuff like that. So all of these variables do work together in that matchmaking process where you match the needs of the projected demand and with your existing supply characteristics of resources. That's where the near-term BAL7 standard is usually helpful in putting a picture to that profile of what you're able to produce. But also in the long term, as the load shape changes, the existing resources now start looking differently. So for example, in California, we are going to see an increased need for long duration energy storage resources. What worked very well for a 4-hour duration would need it to move to 8 to 12 hours in the future, considering the load shape changes. So
And I remember it used to be so simple in ERCOT, you had 100 megawatts of wind and you considered 8.7 megawatts available. That's how much interesting. So when we talk about some other things, grid forming and inverter-based resources being proposed as an aid to grid stability and other reliability services. What planning obstacles are you recognizing or not recognizing for future planning cases? What does that look like? How do you relate to those type of resources in your planning? What does that look like to you? Does it make an effect?
I mean, maybe to make sure that I heard your question well, I heard what obstacles are in the way of your planning going forward.
How do you recognize or not recognize the stated benefits in future planning cases?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the easiest criticism that you can lob at any forecasting and planning group is like, well, you guys were wrong, right? It didn't turn out the way you said it was going to.
Weather forecaster still has a job. 20.
Yeah. I mean, and I get it, right? Like if you look at APS's 2017 integrated resource plan, and what it said the grid was going to look like in 2025, yeah, it's wrong. Like it doesn't look like that. Like we haven't done the same resource procurement. Our load hasn't grown the same. We had no knowledge of these, like this huge boom of extra high load factor customers or the semiconductor manufacturing boom that we've seen in our service territory and the data centers, right? We had no knowledge of those things. And all of those have drastically changed our procurement activities. And I've been in resource planning for 4 years now. I have a background in T&D engineering, electrical engineering degree. I came in from our T&D engineering business, and I did system protection. So I'm used to some of the standards that are probably being covered in other sessions. And in the 4 years that I've been in resource planning, I've seen the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act passed with landmark savings, production tax credits, investment tax credits for clean and renewable technologies going forward. And I've seen the 2025 One Big Beautiful Bill Act passed that has basically repealed the vast majority of those credits outside of some of the energy storage investment tax credits going forward. That's in 3 years. In 3 years, I've seen a federal energy policy completely oscillate from one side to the other. So now, if it takes me, I appreciate the example of 10 months to build a battery, exciting, and certainly we see some of these, timelines increasing. But if it takes me, on average, somewhere between 3 and 5 years to plan, develop, and ultimately build a resource and bring it online, having federal energy policy change so dramatically in a 3-year time span makes my job incredibly difficult. And so finding ways going forward to account for that uncertainty on the system is very much a focus that we have in resource planning. And what does that look like? It looks like understanding it's a balance. It's a balance between making the best decision possible today with the information that you have today, with the economics that you have available to you, with the bids that are in your all source RFP, versus if things change into the future, how bad is this going? Like, how bad could this end up for customers? And so it's never just invest in one type of energy or, only get solar facilities, only get natural gas facilities, only, kind of look at clean technologies. It can never be one thing. You have to balance that diversity because there's going to be times where, all right, look, the tariff situation as it relates to getting things that are produced from China into the United States is incredibly volatile right now. If your batteries are coming from China and they're poorly timed, guess what? That developer is going to come back to you and is going to pass those costs along to you, right? And there's a gamble here essentially that we're seeing. And so, under a lot of cases, having those batteries on the systems, excellent idea, great investment. We're seeing that in our cases. And I don't want to have all of my batteries and all of my resources be subject to this risk that exists out there. And so that's why you have to pursue kind of those other technologies too. So for me, I think the challenge is the uncertainty, which I've just never seen before at this extreme level. And the answer is diversity to it.
Yeah, I think one thing I'll probably add to that is the uncertainty and changing landscape, be it coming from political aspects or load growth, resource technology development, is one of the key reasons why this coordinated planning activity exists and why this is very cyclical in nature. So you're not making a long-term decision for the entire plan at the same time, but you're making incremental decisions along the way where you refine your plan. Like you see here, every 4 years, the plan is changing. Every year when you do your resource plan, it looks very different. So that's why that cyclical nature is there. We are constantly updating our long-term plan, but when it comes to making investment decisions, we are making the best, least regret decision in the short-term environment is the objective of the short-term plan.
Yeah, I can't agree more that it's more challenging today than it ever has been. And that's one point. Your job is challenging already in many respects. And that to me is one of those things that people don't think about as often as they should. It's a critical aspect of our future is how it's planned. So are there any real world experiences with these new technology installations proving their effectiveness that have been incorporated in your planning process? Do you have any examples that you can provide?
I was just going to say, certainly some of the feedback that we get in my service territory is renewables are not reliable. Battery energy storage systems are not reliable. They catch on fire, which they do. Some of them do. But I think if you look at these technologies in aggregate, and if you look at their impact on the system in aggregate, there is 100% a benefit to your system by citing intermittent technologies on that system. They do allow you to serve some amount of incremental load into the future. It may not be as high of an amount if you're looking at just from a nameplate to what we call an ELCC basis or an effective load carrying capability basis. That's that 100 megawatts to 8.7 that you were talking about, right? So, if you look at that and you say, okay, wind resources, 100 megawatt wind farm is only worth 8.7 megawatts. Two things I think you should take away from that. It is worth 8.7. It's not zero. It's worth something to you going forward. And just because it's only worth 8.7 megawatts from a kind of peak capacity basis doesn't mean that that was a bad investment. It just means that you're using that investment as a source of energy on your system and you're deferring some other kind of generation instead that you would be running that now you're getting it from the wind facility. And there's a benefit to customers there. So I feel like the technologies, certainly like the major ones that are on the screen right now, are demonstrated technologies. APS has leaned really heavily into battery energy storage. We're going to have 6 gigawatts of batteries, roughly 6 gigawatts of batteries on our system by 2029. Our current peak is 8,600 megawatts. That's a lot of batteries. So clearly we feel bullish about that technology, and we believe that this technology is a good technology because there's going to be failures. There have been failures. We're learning from those failures. The manufacturers, I think, are changing their chemistries. They're changing their safety requirements. We've learned from our failures at APS, where we had installed battery storage systems in the 2017, 2018 timeframe, caught on fire, and did a very rigorous root cause analysis about it, rewrote our safety requirements as it relates to them, launched a massive training program for first responders for battery fires because it's a different kind of fire. And I think you've now built in more resiliency for these technologies going forward. And I mean, there's inherent risks to every technology, every resource type. I mean, you look at generators or your typical thermal generation, and there's a ton of heat that's involved. There's risk of thermal expansion. You can have explosions at these facilities too. Like every single resource has inherent safety concerns. You're in the business of producing massive amounts of power. It's just how fast can we learn and how can we limit any kind of safety, both from our employees and the public in the process.
Mathematically, we've come from 500 megawatts of batteries in 2020 to about 14,000 megawatts of batteries in the CAISO Balancing Authority in 25. So embracing new technology.
Yeah, it works. It works. It works. Now, one thing I will say, I try not to say failures, incomplete success. Try that. Sounds so much more positive.
When you see the news with the
Yeah,
big
yeah.
fireballs, it feels like failure is probably the better word, but I hear what you're saying.
I think Edison had a lot of incomplete successes on the incandescent light bulb before he had success and made it work, if you think about that. So let's switch over to load and demand. And there was a discussion about large loads in a couple of different areas here. And I got some links here that show there's significant change in data centers. I mean, 500 billion Stargate project, 1.1 billion data center rollout, crypto miners, different thought process here. I really want to focus a little bit, or don't forget about that home battery fleet test, because that's another aspect that you may have not considered 3 years ago. Don't know, but there was a good example of that this last year. Or this year, I guess it was. But when you think about that, when you see that increasing size and frequency, what has been impacted in terms of resource needs or resource deliverability? What have you been seeing there? If you missed, you may have missed, that we're talking about these large loads coming to people saying, I want to build something here, and it's on the end of a transmission line that wasn't there before, no reliability standards, quote unquote, associated with it. A lot of impact to that TO. He's looking at, can I support that? And can I do it in 18 months? So what have you been seeing in terms of resource needs on that and resource deliverability?
More demand drives up more generation requirements because now you need more generation. The type of demand also influences the selection of resources to a certain extent. When you have flat load data centers, for example, you kind of need a large amount of energy generation that can meet that 24 hours energy production needs. Then you have transportation electrification, which is a little more flexible load. It drives and calls for different aspects of generation requirements. So basically, our demand projections have significantly increased, about 6 gigawatts more load by 2030 than last year's demand forecast. So that's a huge amount of load forecast driven by building electrification, transportation electrification, and data centers that are slated for the CAISO area. So that is happening, and there is about 4 gigs of that 6 gigs is coming from data center load growth. So that's huge. And then the California Public Utilities Commission's new authorized procurement going up to 2032, 1,500 megawatts of It's called NQC capacity, net qualifying capacity resources, that doesn't have any resource fuel type associated with it. Kind of shows the significant need of incremental additions to be added to the system every year. So that is driving up demand and needs on the system.
Yeah, I agree. I'm going to play off your premise of more demand, more generation, which is 100% true. And especially as you see kind of more of these flat demands. And if the resources that you're primarily buying right now, solar, batteries, wind, I mean, they're not dispatchable resources. They're not baseload resources. All of a sudden, you just start thinking to yourself at the highest level possible, if solar has a capacity factor in the desert Southwest of about 33%, which we've got great sun in Arizona and parts of California and all around the desert Southwest, and I have a load factor that's 92%. Well, like, let's not even talk about time matching. So 33% for solar farm capacity factor. The wind energy that we see around our service territory ranges from about 25% to 38% capacity factor for wind resources. We have some access to New Mexico, which has better capacity factors. You can get into the 40s, potentially the 50s of capacity factor for wind resources there. Okay, so now I've got 33 plus, we'll call it some really nice wind resources from New Mexico at a 45% capacity factor. I'm still short. And so if I have a 100 megawatt load, and now I've got 300 megawatts of nameplate resources, not even talking about resource adequacy, not talking about time matching of the load and the generation, not talking about cloud covers and Dunkelflautes and all of that. What's the thing that becomes the constraining element more than anything else? Transmission. Your transmission system becomes the bottleneck. And what takes the longest to build out of all of these resources? Large scale 500 kV bulk electric transmission. And you look at the permitting process, you look at the siting process, you look at getting NEPA review for it, and then the ultimate construction of those facilities. We go back and forth with our transmission planning team. We have a strategic transmission development team that we've stood up over the last 2 years at APS. And oftentimes the timeline is more than 10 years. And if you look at some of the developments certainly surrounding us in the West, one that's recently come to fruition that I got to tour was the SunZia DC line that travels from New Mexico into the southeastern part of Arizona. That project has been in development for 20 years. 20 years from people like cooking up this project, starting to do due diligence on it, to ultimately it coming to fruition. And so we have an incredible need that's happening on the load side. We're going to build a ton of generation to help, meet that need, maintain reliability for that need. And we're not realistically able to build enough transmission in the time frame allotted for us to keep up. And so you're going to see transmission congestion that increases dramatically into the future. And with that transmission congestion comes just more complexity on what resources are going to be available to serve your customers. And so I think that it just speaks to the complexity of maintaining reliability going forward. When, in the past, if you've got a coal plant and it's base loaded, you got transmission to your coal plant. Well, the transmission is utilized up to the nameplate capacity of your coal plant most of the time, and that coal plant's running a lot. And it's just not the same dynamic that we see today.
I want to move over to that demand side based on time. She's about to give me that 10-minute time limit, I think. I can read her mind. But when you look at that California gets that grid, that record from 100,000 homes, they utilize residential batteries to produce 535 megawatts over peak. Very unique experiment. Very, very something that was, like I said, probably not thought about in a large degree. Had to be planned, and hopefully they worked with CalISO on that planning. I don't remember who the companies were involved and all that. Somebody can select the link and go down that thought process. But there's a lot of different demand response thoughts that are out there. While that's an operational example of that capability, how does that translate into planning for the future? Do you plan for this on every day? Do you plan for it on peak days? Do you plan for it on my birthday, what do you do? What does it look like to you to look at this?
I'll share my personal example and extrapolate it to the ISO level. In my house was a new construction home, so it came with a 4.2 kilowatt system solar built that came with the house. We built a pergola in the backyard. That's a 2.2 kilowatt solar system. My local utility has a $10,000 rebate if I built a storage 13 kilowatt hour, 2 megapacks storage facilities. So I'm trying to get those two pieces there. And when I think about what I do at work and what my investment choices for generation and storage at home are, I often try to bridge the gap and see how would the ISO at the largest level know what all the little tweaks that I am doing. Time of use rates will change my when I run my washer and when I run my dryers. That are those little behavioral aspects which can be probably trained. But when it comes to popping up a new storage resource that the utility would have information on, but application and utilization is driven by the user unless I sign up for that program. So there it is a multi-layer problem, not problem, opportunity, where you have to really think about what are the customers making investment choices in, and how can that help the system in normal operating conditions and in severe extreme operating conditions, which both require different programs in place. The example that you highlighted, Curtis, shows the power of all of these incremental resources that are in the system, but obviously more resources better. But having more visibility and control will become more important. And the previous presentation and also more of these discussions that are happening as you talk about large load additions to the system, the load flexibility that they provide can also be factored in your resource selection process, will also offer an entirely different perspective of what resources you might need. So
You know, in your plan, 6 gigawatts of batteries, are you thinking this might happen in Arizona?
Yeah, we just revised our residential and commercial side battery forecast, and it's taken off. I mean, there still are incentives that are coming from the federal government around battery storage. I anticipate that there's going to be more investment in it in our service territory. I think, from my perspective, I think what's challenging here is there's absolutely benefit to customer-sided resources, whether it's energy efficiency, whether it's demand response programs, or whether it's batteries that are, moving their, solar to another time period. We see this value in our system all the time. The complicating factor is, into the future, you still are going to have this level of uncertainty associated with customer behavior. That how do I quantify when I'm thinking about the reliability of my resources? And so as you start new programs and as programs scale from, basically being rounding error on your system to being material, to being an actual resource that you are depending on as a utility that, needs to show up, that customer behavior aspect of it becomes incredibly important to you. If folks opt out of these programs and don't allow you to dispatch their batteries, or during a particular event, instead of bring their battery offline. I think that the easier example of this is we have a thermostat program called Cool Rewards that works over the peak times during the summer when it's incredibly hot outside. And, if we have a heat wave that occurs over multiple days and we're adjusting folks' thermostats in their houses to increase the temperature in their house and therefore decrease the ultimate generation burden that there is to the system, on the third, fourth, and fifth days of a heat wave, people are tired of that. And so they, override that system. And I think there's going to be some level of, consumer behavior as it relates to the batteries as well, or just imperfection in how consumers set up their batteries if there isn't utility control over them. Like you were saying, Aditya, like if I can't dispatch your battery and you have imperfect knowledge of my system, well, then there's just going to be a suboptimal outcome. So it's all just how do you discount those resources, understanding that they're going to provide value, but at what level going forward?
Yeah, and being from Central Texas, I didn't sign up for the no AC. I can guarantee you. And it's so great in Colorado that you can count the number of three-digit days on one hand and not raise a single finger. It was so great this last year not to have a 100-degree day. Felt great. But I think that's important to think about it. You hit on a very, very critical aspect of it. Those consumers, how they're investing, what they're doing, and getting that information up. And I know there's some, call it DER and some other aspects in the standards that are coming out that may not even capture that, but they have to think about what is possibly out there and how it's going to interact. So I think that's interesting. In fact, I think there's some abeyance language on gathering data at certain levels, but we don't want to talk about that. We don't want to talk about it. Now, volatility and landscape, you already hit on it a little bit, but there's a lot of opportunities out there, and there's been a lot of frontline page headlines. In fact, there's probably one today. In fact, I think I saw one that somehow canceled the largest solar farm in the United States, if I'm not mistaken. I didn't get to read it. Had too many other opportunities. But do changes proposed in the current administration prompt changes to your planning, or because planning timelines exceed any single administration? And I want to point out, I pulled links all the way back to Clinton and Bush, because it's nothing that's new. It's just a little more dramatic, perhaps, at this point, a little more front page news to people, because it's impacting it differently than it did 25 years ago, although there were changes in the administration. So because that timelines exceed it, does it result in adjustments rather than wholesale changes? Oh, we're going this way. What does that look like? And I know you kind of answered it earlier, but can we pull on that thread just a little bit? What does that look like? I mean, you said you've been in 4 years. I didn't remember how many years you've been in planning. 18 years. So you've got longer breath, but you've been for. Tell me your thoughts on that, and then we'll.
Yeah, I mean, this is with my engineering background, and maybe some of you can sympathize. This is one of the things that maybe I struggled with a little bit as I came into resource planning and as I was learning more about this role is, say I've got an all-source RFP and I've collected all the bids for my all-source RFP and I've got a project that competes really well. It looks economically fantastic, good support for my customer reliability into the future, less cost than other projects. But what if it doesn't have all of the federal permits it needs, and there is an administration, hypothetically, that is waging war on wind permitting, hypothetically, whether that be offshore or onshore wind? Well, here's a resource that may look really good on paper, but ultimately, if I'm going to contract with that resource, I'm committing my customers' dollars to that. And I need to know that it's going to show up. I need to know that it's going to be there. And if I contract with that resource and say, okay, I want to move forward in the development of this resource, and there's a developer obviously that's doing all of the construction and managing and those pieces of it, and 3 years down the road, all of the permitting falls apart, they're not able to bring it into service, I get no benefit from that resource. And I was relying on that resource into the future. And so it absolutely impacts our planning as it relates to, like, there may be projects that have more risk on a permitting basis than in the past, and that makes them less attractive for us to pursue. And it just makes it harder, I think, for us to commit to projects that we know are going to face those considerable challenges. And so all of this boils down to a really cheap option that isn't going to come to fruition isn't an option at all.
Nothing to add when we are at the top of the hour. So,
And I think I've been told we're pretty much done. This is where our break time is. Okay, so I won't ask you any more questions, but should we open it up for questions, or just, if you have any questions, ask us and I'll send it to them. All right. Yeah, if we have any we'll answer them online. So please, but thank these gentlemen for being up here.
Thank you.
Thank them for doing their job. Thank you. And we're on break